presentation. Dave Adams is going to present on the four-tiered process that New York is going through now. Dave is in the Office of Invasive Species Coordination, where I work, and he is our regulatory and policy coordinator. So, Dave, it's all yours.
Good morning, folks. Glad to see everyone, or each of the PRISMs, could participate this morning. I think I may have spoken with at least a percentage of the PRISM coordinators, maybe a year ago or so, with an update on the four-tier project. So I'll just run through some slides to give you a quick update of the overall process, and then show you a few of the outcomes, particularly related to plants, and provide some possible opportunities for PRISM coordinators and members to participate in the review of the outcomes and information gathering so that we can move our whole process forward. And as some of you will remember who have seen this presentation in the past, the work that we're doing is through the Council with input from the Advisory Committee, and it's mandated through Title 17. Here in the title slide, you'll see the New York State form and the PRISM form as originally drafted, with the thought that regional PRISM data, mainly distribution information, could be gathered at the PRISM level and then combined for the statewide form. And of course, the fact that we've had some hurdles in getting paid coordinators set up for each of the PRISMs, and each of the PRISMs are in a different stage of development, it made the use of the PRISM form a little bit challenging for our first round of assessments. And so the reality is we're focusing on the state form, gathering all the information we can about distribution in PRISMs, but we're really not focusing on having the PRISMs complete PRISM forms to reach these species, because I don't think it's a realistic expectation for this first round of assessment. That being said, if information is out there and someone has the interest for completing PRISM forms for any of the species, we would welcome that information. And for some reason the computer is locking up, but
Are you on play PowerPoint?
PowerPoint slideshow?
Yeah, see if you're actually on play the PowerPoint. You should be.
There we go. Okay. Just a little bit of background information. Regional regulations that currently are on the books in various states. If you look at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Region 5, which is shown in the map in the center, West Virginia on up to Maine, various states have lists of plants primarily, with a few species existing outside of the plant world, particularly in New Hampshire and Maryland. But primarily the work historically has been focused on plants, and these states have anywhere from a single species up to about 140 species listed as restricted or prohibited. So in New York, of course, we have regional efforts that started in 2007 and 2008 in Suffolk and Nassau counties, listing about 62 to 65 species in those respective counties as restricted or prohibited for sale. And several executive orders, Westchester County being one of the primary executive orders, regarding the use of native species in county projects. So what does Title 17 charge the Council to do? And where does the four-tier team notion come from? Well, if you look at the list here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, that's where the four-tier team name comes from. A list of species to be prohibited, a list of species to be regulated, and an unregulated list of species, as well as a procedure for the review of non-native invasive species. So hence the fourth tier is the process. And recommendations for legislation, including penalties for violation, as well as a report which originally was supposed to be submitted by January 2010. Unfortunately, due to staff limitations and fiscal challenges, we probably won't get this report completed until mid-2010. So we'll be a little bit late, hopefully not too late. The charge was for the four-tier team to act as a steering committee and develop the procedures balancing harm with benefits, produce draft lists of species, and complete assessments for a draft report, which would be circulated for public input. Who's working on the four-tier team? Well, here on the right you can see about 16 organizations ranging from internal DEC divisions, Division of Lands and Forests, Division of Fish, Wildlife, Marine Resources, Division of Water, as well as other state agencies, New York State Department of Ag and Markets, and a number of NGOs, the Farm Bureau, Nursery and Landscape Association, PJAC, Nature Conservancy, Trout Unlimited, USDA, APHIS, and PPQ, Wildlife Services and PPQ, Plant Protection Quarantine Units, New York State Department of Transportation, and the New York and Lake Champlain Sea Grant programs, as well as SUNY Albany. So we have quite a few people at the table. Not everyone makes every single meeting, but for the most part we have input from all of these stakeholders in the four-tier team work. There's benefits to that. You get a varying viewpoint. There's challenges. When you have a lot of people working together on a project, things go a little bit slower. As far as scientific specialists that we've reached out to as we've been working on these lists and assessment protocols, Dr. Bern Blasi, Dr. Dave Strayer, Dr. Richard Hoback, and Dr. George Kramer have all agreed to work with us throughout the process to fine-tune our assessment tools, look at our species list for appropriateness, and in the end, review our outcomes to make sure everything seems to be appropriate. For immediate tasks, we are working with various work groups, including a terrestrial plant and aquatic plant team, terrestrial vertebrate team, terrestrial invertebrate, and fish and aquatic invertebrate working groups. And this is where the actual on-the-ground work of completing assessments, developing assessment protocols for those particular taxa groups, reaching out to individual stakeholders that might be able to help us gather information for those assessments occurs. We've also developed timeline, screening tools, and listing procedures, as you'll see in a few moments here. The final products will be a report in mid-2010, but ongoing, to meet the needs of that report, we need to complete species assessments for the plants, which we have about 140 plant draft assessments completed, as well as the other work groups. In addition to the invasivity assessment, we need to complete a social economic assessment. And so with the plant group, that's where we are right now. We need to complete social economic assessments for about 140 species that have already gone through the invasivity assessment. For the non-plant taxa groups, we need to complete both. So we have quite a bit of work to do before we have the main guts of the report completed. Keep in mind that this report will not be all-encompassing. These 140 plants and the list of non-plant taxa that we include will really be just the top worst of the worst species that are fairly well known as invasive species. And there'll be a need to continue assessments in the future for updates. To date, we've had 15 monthly team meetings, developed some internal principles for working together, come up with a timeline which has been revised several times, and a flowchart indicating our process for listing species. And as I indicated earlier, about 140 plant assessments have been done due to an arrangement between TNC and Brooklyn Botanic Garden, 2 draft initial assessments. They're now undergoing a review by botany experts throughout the state. And here you see our timeline for the project, which has been extended. But as you can see, we started in the spring of '08, and we hope to have a report in mid-2010. You see the timeline continue into the end of 2010 because we need to complete a rules and regulations package in the long term so that these various recommendations can actually become law. So what you'll see is a final report submitted to the legislature and the governor's office by June 2010 with ongoing work to complete the guts of what will be needed to develop our rules and regulations package sometime either later in 2010 or in early 2011. Hence, up in the top here you see a stage 1 and a stage 2 in the process. Stage 1 is the work we need to do to complete the report. Stage 2 is the additional effort that's required to complete the rules and regulations package. So when I say the report will only include information that really is focused on developing a process and then putting through well-known invasive species through that process to demonstrate the outcomes. The rules and regulations package needs to be a little more comprehensive and really hit the well-known invasives that we want to review and possibly regulate in the future. I'll step you through this one. This is really our primary process diagram to how all this may work out. The four-tier team works with a list of species that have been developed using stakeholder input. If any of those species are currently listed in the Lacey Act or other federal lists, they don't necessarily need to be assessed because they're already restricted or regulated at the federal level. So they are automatically regulated at the state level. For those species, though, that are not federally listed, we conduct an invasivity assessment. We also conduct a social economic assessment. The outcome of the invasivity assessment places a species tentatively in a regulatory classification as either prohibited, regulated, or unregulated. The social economic assessment is completed to provide information for the four-tier team members, advisory committee members, and the council members in placing a species in a final recommendation classification for regulation. And I don't have the three different categories listed here because it may be that those that came out as high or very high in the invasivity ranking tentatively were put in the prohibited classification may in the long run remain in the prohibited classification. But the information in the social economic tool may allow team members or the advisory committee or the council to modify that initial tentative status and place these species in a lower regulatory classification or in the regulated and unregulated classification at a higher regulatory classification. And that would be based on information in the social economic assessment as one uses that information to place species in a final category. So it's a little bit complicated with lots of boxes and colors and arrows, but as we've worked through this process with all the stakeholders, it's a process that everyone could buy into, everyone had input into, and I think it'll work quite well. So what does the plant invasiveness assessment tool look like? Those of you that have had a chance to look at this in the past recognize that there's 4 different categories: ecological impacts, biological characteristics, ecological amplitude and distribution, and difficulty of control. Basically 40, 25, 25, and 10% of the assessment. And outcomes are ranked as either 80 or higher, very high, 70 to 80, high, 50 to 70, medium, or low or insignificant. To date, about 140 species have been assessed, and my last count, I probably need to update these numbers a little bit, but 28 species in the plant taxa came out as very high in invasivity assessment, 35 high, 49 medium, 10 low, and then there were several that had either not the ability to withstand New York State winters or not enough information was available to assess those species. So there's a few here that didn't make it into any of those categories. They may find more information and be able to complete the assessments, or the species may be one that is not capable of surviving New York State weather. So at this point, we're reaching out to about 27 botany experts to review these draft assessments, provide information. Anyone who has an interest in reviewing these can go to the NYIS info/resources webpage. You can find the draft assessments for all 140 species there. And as I indicated earlier, if you have any information that would alter these assessment outcomes, we'd be very much appreciative if you could send us a note. And I gave the experts until October 31st, but that can always be extended. In the future, we hope to have a little bit of money to continue species assessments, both in the plant world and the non-plant taxa, such that we can complete both the report and a regulatory package in a timely manner. And later in the process, we will have a widespread public review of the assessments, the outcomes, the report language. At this point, we don't have enough language, though, for the draft report to go public. So it's primarily internal. And the goal for much of this work is to reach consensus among the stakeholders at the table. And one definition that one could use for consensus is everyone must be at least 70% comfortable with decisions that are made and 100% committed to the implementation. And that's challenging to reach with a varied group of various stakeholders as we've got at the table here. But we've made good progress. The process has developed nicely, though a little slower than I thought it might. And slow but sure, we'll crank out the assessments.